Good evening. Hey, everybody. Welcome. Yes, thank you. Welcome. So nice to have you here at the second Santa Fe Livability in the Land of Enchantment speaker series session of 2025, Bridging the Gap, Missing Middle Housing to Strengthen Santa Fe. I'm Johanna Gilligan. I'm the Deputy CEO at HomeWise, and I'm really happy to be here with you all this evening. Thanks for braving the rain for us tonight. As you know, this is our third year running Livability program here in Santa Fe. The series is designed to provide an opportunity for residents and decision makers to learn together from local and national speakers how land use policies affect how affordable and livable our city is. Tonight, we'll be focusing on missing middle housing, the spectrum of smaller scale, multi-unit housing types that bridge the gap between single-family homes and large apartment complexes, and how we tailor those to Santa Fe's unique urban landscape. I think this will be a really interesting conversation that is going to really connect the dots around a lot of issues for us. I'd like to take a moment to thank our incredible sponsors that helped make this event possible. Our Livability luminary sponsor is the Santa Fe Housing Action Coalition. Our affordability ally sponsors are the La Fonda Foundation, the Santa Fe Chamber of Commerce, Santa Fe Habitat for Humanity. Our sustainability steward sponsor is Christus St. Vincent, and our Friends of the Series sponsor is Friends of Architecture Santa Fe. Thank you so much. Yes. In addition to those friends who are contributing financially to this program, we'd also like to thank our partners that have helped to really develop this series in vision, in content, shape how we ask questions. It's just really a fun group project. So these include many of those that we've already listed, as well as the Santa Fe Watershed Association, the Santa Fe Area Home Builders Association, Midtown Arts and Design Alliance, Santa Fe MPO, Urban Land Institute, Mass Design Group, Chainbreaker, YouthWorks, and Evan Ripley Architect. Big shout out to all of our partners. Lastly, a few quick logistics. You can use this QR code up on the screen to view the program for this evening. And in a few moments, we'll hear from our speaker. Afterwards, we'll have a panel portion with some time for Q&A. We will accept questions electronically via Slido through the evening. To participate, please use the QR code or visit the Slido website and input the number shown. Once you are in Slido, you can click Q&A and the green Ask button to submit your questions. I think most people are familiar with this, but yes, I see people taking phones out. That's exactly what you should be doing. Get this QR code and then put the number 507 in there so you can tee up your questions. You can even plug them in while Dan is speaking. So, thanks for being here. I'm now very pleased to introduce our speaker this evening. We have with us tonight DanParolek. Daniel is an architect, urban designer, and the founding principal of Opticos Design, which has grown into a nationally sought-after company of thought leaders in urban placemaking, innovative housing design, and policy and zoning reform. He has been featured in many high-profile publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Next City, and Professional Builder. He coined the term missing middle housing and is a champion of the now international missing middle housing movement. He recently presented on the topic at the Chicago Humanities Festival. He also co-authored the book Form-Based Codes, which Planetizen called one of the top planning books of 2007, and co-founded the nonprofit think tank, the Form-Based Code Institute. He released the book Missing Middle Housing, Thinking Big and Building Small to respond to today's housing crisis, also a top urban planning book of 2020. In 2023, he was voted one of Planetizen's 100 most influential urbanists, past and present. He's also a really nice guy. When I was hanging out with him today, he was like, please make sure not to use the long bio, which I think is a real reflection of a person who's accomplished a lot and is very humble about it all. So it's my sincere pleasure to welcome Daniel up to the stage.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be back in Santa Fe tonight, and what a great audience, and thanks to HomeWise for hosting this amazing Livability speaker series. I'm super excited to be part of it. So I started Opticos Design 25 years ago because I wanted to deliver innovative housing solutions and walkable living solutions at both an architecture scale and through planning. And what we realized very quickly is that zoning reform needed to be a really big part of that, because it was a barrier for everything we were trying to do with both our private sector clients as well as our public sector clients. In 2007, we were super excited to become a B Corporation. And through that B Corporation commitment, we are committed to a triple bottom line of social, environmental, and fiscal responsibility. And that still drives the decision making in our company today. And it's super excited about that. So it's really interesting as I reflected back on sort of how missing middle housing sort of grew and evolved over the years, and realized that Santa Fe played an integral role in planting the seeds of missing middle in my head in 2009. I'll tell you a little bit about that in just a second. But I do keep hearing that we don't think there's a lot of missing middle housing here. And I'll tell you that based on past research and having spent 3 hours almost yesterday wandering around with Weston Glass and Chuck Wolf, who's in the room somewhere, you have an amazing collection of historic examples of missing middle housing. But what's really interesting about them is most of them are hidden, which is a really good thing, right? It's lots of housing that is integrated into a really great feeling neighborhood. And here is my favorite missing middle photo from all of Santa Fe walking tour yesterday, right? You're walking along a street, you look at a building, it looks like a single family house or maybe a couple of them along the street, and then you see a cluster of mailboxes. And you realize that there's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 units on each one of these lots. And so that's really the premise behind, and it fits really nicely into those neighborhoods. It's delivering housing choices in these highly desirable neighborhoods. So I think that that's just a really sort of integral part of how we talk about and reinforce missing middle in neighborhoods. So in 2009, I studied Santa Fe urban and housing patterns extensively for this Greenworks housing competition. Does anybody in the room remember this? Okay, there's 2, 3, 4. So our team at Opticos actually ended up winning this design competition with this courtyard housing solution that fit 600 to 1,000 square foot units onto a 1/4 acre site in the West Side Guadalupe Historic District on Alto Street, sorry. It's my Midwestern accent that comes through sometimes. And so I can talk I'm going to sort of plant some seeds of this and integrate it through my presentation as I talk about the characteristics of missing middle housing. But more recently, we teamed up with the city and actually worked on the Midtown Master Plan and the zoning code to implement that. So I know that'll probably be a part of the conversation as well. That was a really exciting project locally here for us to work on. So what's really exciting to me is that this idea and this concept that I came up with now 13, 14 years ago really has become a movement. And I wouldn't have actually ever imagined that it would spread so broadly. And I'm super excited about that. And so, see if okay, it'll transition. So this slide was the picture of a really great housing type that we used in a conversation in a project in 2000 in Santa Barbara County. And this is one of those projects where we as the consultants stepped in the room, the very first meeting with the task force, neighborhood task force. And the first thing they said is, we're not going to accept anything more than 18 units per acre. That was just the idea that they pounced on. 18 units per acre is going to ruin our neighborhood. Don't you dare. And we're just what does that mean? What is 18 and why isn't it 18.5 or 19 or 16 or 14? Where does that number, what does that mean and why are you afraid of it? And then more important, we said, well, let's back away from this number and let's go for a walking tour. And so we took the task force on a walking tour of Santa Barbara. And if you've ever been to Santa Barbara, you know it has one of the richest collections of historic missing middle types in the entire United States. And so bungalow courts, duplexes, fourplexes, neighborhood main streets, and then we come to this type, and that there was a consensus amongst all the task force members that this is their favorite type. And so we said, this is great. So what do you like about it? It's about the scale, the way it addresses the street, the parking's in the back. It could be a big house, right? You don't even know that there's multiple units in it. And so we said, well, if we can write a plan that will deliver this scale and quality of housing and write a zoning code that can predictably deliver those results, would you support it? And everybody said yes. So we very quickly, we had our wheels, we measured the lot, counted the mailboxes, came back and we said, this is almost 40 units per acre. And it immediately disarmed the conversation, and we sort of had a healthy conversation about how we can write a plan for base zoning that would deliver this. And so I think a big part of Missing Middle is the success of it is it's given communities a tool and a way to frame the conversation about housing without using these terms like density that come with a lot of baggage. Because I can guarantee if you go into any neighborhood in Santa Fe or any neighborhood anywhere in the country and say, we're gonna write a neighborhood plan that triples the density in your neighborhood, you're gonna get thrown out of the room, right? And so this backs away, and let's talk about the form and the scale and the typology or the type. I know Chris Wilson talked about this a little bit in his presentation. I'm just going to continue to reinforce that. Sorry. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. I'm going the wrong way, so I apologize. The other thing is just the most basic idea of removing the barriers and making these simple housing choices legal, right? The cottage court, and this is an example of a cottage court that we designed and was built recently in Healdsburg, California, is the type that almost everybody can have consensus on, is like, we love this type, it's a favorite type, but it is actually illegal in like 99.9% of all zoning in the country. I actually haven't found a modern version of the cottage court that has been built by right under a conventional zoning code. So that's just, the idea is like, why shouldn't we, or let's make an effort to make these types legal. Oops. So why is this so important to be talking about today? It's always really amazing to see such a big group coming out to talk about this, because you understand this, but I like to understand this. Geez, I keep misdriving this. So right, in addition to the shortage of housing that's been delivered all across the country, including in Santa Fe, right, there is a gap between the types of housing that local households both want and need and what's being delivered. And you can say that about any market in the country, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. It's all this big gap in between the single family homes and more conventional garden apartments or bigger, more urban residential buildings. In addition, right, over the course of the last 15 to 20 years, there's just been this tsunami happening of household demographic shifts that also make it important for us to be delivering different types of housing, not the same old types of housing that we've been delivering for the past 50 or 60 years. Just as a start, 1/3 of all households in any city are a single person. Do you think we're designing and building housing that's specific to the needs and desires of a single person household? Absolutely not. By 2030, 1 in 5 Americans will be over the age of 65. Increasing multicultural society, right? More interest in multi-generational living, because a lot of cultures choose to live multi-generationally, sort of on purpose. And then, right, by 2025, right now, up to 85% of households won't have children. Right? And so this idea that we need to be building housing for people, the family with 2 kids and a dog, it's like, yes, we do, but we've done a lot of that. So there's already a lot of stock for that, but we need to be building a lot more housing for much smaller households. The other thing that I want to reinforce is that over 50% of Americans want to live in a walkable neighborhood, and only 8% of our built environment delivers it. And I tell people I'm not an economist, but I'm smart enough to know that high demand and low supply equals really high housing prices. And that's why the most expensive neighborhoods are also like the ones you can walk to downtown and walk to a main street and walk to a coffee shop. I just encourage you to look up the preference survey that the National Association of Realtors does biannually. It has some really great statistics about even 78% of households will pay more for a home in a walkable neighborhood. And that they're willing to give up the single family detached house for that walkability as well. So just really interesting data out there, right? This growing aging population, and right, what does that mean in terms of the types of housing and the types of neighborhoods we need to be delivering to accommodate that? And this is the reason that AARP National has become one of the biggest advocates for missing middle housing. So this document that we produced for AARP now, I think 3 years ago, is downloadable for free. If you just Google AARP missing middle housing, this will come up. And what I'll tell you is I knew this was reaching the right audience when my father-in-law on a Saturday morning emailed me and said, I just got my AARP newsletter and it's talking about missing middle housing. Is that you? Like, yes. So, right, it's reaching a much bigger audience, and they have 40 million members. So that's a really big umbrella to be sort of talking to missing middle about. Okay, then this rapidly growing lack of affordability, and I don't think I need to talk, I'm not the statistician here, but your city, just like other highly desirable cities, just gets more and more, has more and more lack of affordability. And that's not going to slow down. And so missing middle is not the silver bullet, but it is one tool that every city should have in their housing toolbox to help address this lack of affordability, for sure. And then, did you know that zoning was created and first implemented, and the system it still works on was created the same year that that camera was built? Right? So what other 100-year-old operating system can you think of that we're still using? None? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. They're in the process of fixing it, right? And as is every city. But the reason the reason it's so ineffective as every other city is it's operating on this system that's 100 years old, that's not sort of meeting 21st century challenges or meant to deliver 21st century housing choices. And to be honest, these zoning codes, most historic missing middle was built prior to zoning codes being put in place. And the zoning was forced on top of it, these neighborhoods. And that's why you have these overlays to try to sort of address those unique characteristics. And it was never intended to deliver walkable places. It was created to deliver suburbs, auto-dependent suburbs, post-World War. And so just some thoughts about why it's not functioning. It's not really functioning anywhere. So what is missing middle housing? So first and foremost for us, the middle equals form and scale and housing type. And so let's talk a little bit about that, right? This gap of all of these types that we built historically in neighborhoods, a triplex, the cottage court, the courtyard apartment, that we basically regulated out of existence, and the systems that delivered them disappeared. And you know, this is a list of types that applies to a lot of American cities, but I would say a place like Santa Fe, that palette and that catalog of types needs to be nuanced to the really rich and much longer history that you have here in this city. And new types need to be added to that, and maybe some of them even taken out of that list. And this is, if you're going to take one idea away from my presentation tonight, this is it. The idea that missing middle is house scale buildings with multiple units. in walkable neighborhoods. And so that house scale is super important because just because you're putting more units in a building doesn't mean the building's getting really big. All of these examples are the scale of a house. They feel like a house along the street. They just happen to have multiple units inside of that. That's really, really important from a communication and from a like how you deliver it in your zoning and your policy of like differentiating that scale. We launched missingmiddlehousing.com in 2016. It's still a great online resource, a lot of free information. And then my book came out in 2020 and is still sort of really relevant and selling super well because the housing crisis isn't going away, unfortunately, anytime soon. So this idea of house scale, once again, I just want to show a couple of examples, right? This building, this was built about 5 years ago, right? You could walk by it, drive by it, ride your bike by it, and not even notice that this was a triplex, right? Because it behaves like a single-family home, and it's mixed within a bunch of single-family houses and a few other missing middle housing types. The same can be said for this design competition entry that we designed here locally, right? The building type had 6 units, but as it behaved along the street, it behaved like a single-family home. And then as you went back further into the lot, you experienced those additional units. And so this house scale, when you start thinking about zoning and how you regulate that, it's important to regulate the height of the buildings, which is pretty common, but it's also super important to regulate a maximum width of the building along the street, as well as a maximum depth of the building into the lot. And so we can talk a little bit about that. I could do a whole presentation on just that and why that's important, but to get to house scale, you need all 3 of those form elements very thoughtfully regulated. And then secondarily, and this is important too, is that the middle, if you're very thoughtful about how you allow these, the development community can deliver these at a price point that can be attainable to middle income. And I would say it varies by market, but I would say like 80% median income and above, typically, plus or minus a few. And that's a really key part of this in terms of a attainability solution. So if you look at this affordability barbell, this is a graphic that we created, right? You have subsidized affordability, which kind of delivers to kind of the lower household income levels on one end. And then you have increased supply, which helps generally reduce sort of prices. And then the missing middle types fit right in the middle to deliver what we call affordability by design, if it's thoughtfully enabled and delivered. And why do we call it missing is that between 1990 and 2013, only less than 10% of all housing units delivered were these missing middle housing types. And it's actually it's actually decreased substantially since this was done. So I'm going to quickly go through the missing middle housing types, and then after that I'm going to dive into some of the solutions that we've been delivering for cities and counties and developers across the country. And so it's really, really important, and I'm going to suggest that you all become very well versed in missing middle type terminology so that it's a shared vocabulary so you can step away from that default to try to defaulting to a density or defaulting to a discussion about multifamily, which is also like, well, yes, it kind of fits into that category, but it's also very different than a lot of other outcomes that you can get that are called multifamily. And so if you all can just become really versant in the missing middle typologies, it would be really, really helpful in general housing conversations, but also in just conversations about your zoning code update and your comprehensive plan update. You could be like, you can ask your staff, like, well, is that zoning district enabling the duplex, the triplex, and the fourplex? Or is it the cottage court and the fiveplex? Like, those are the sorts of conversations that you should be happening. Or where is the comp plan going to allow the fourplex, fiveplex, and the cottage court in the city? Those are all really great questions. And so that's a really good tip. And so be specific about which types will go where. It's really, really important. So let me just quickly go through these. So there's a side-by-side duplex. And what I'd say is you have a lot of these. I saw a lot of these just yesterday. And it's just simply, 2 units attached at the middle. There's some really creative design solutions, like I saw a lot of the doors facing sort of perpendicular to the street, so you don't actually notice that it's a duplex. A lot of different styles of this throughout Santa Fe. But what I really love, and this is a nuance of how this pattern evolved in Santa Fe, is if you look back into these deep lots, there's like other duplexes, other casitas, other ADUs. Sometimes they're formal compounds, and other times it looked like they just organically happened over the course of, 10, 15, 20, 30, maybe more years. And I think there's really something in those patterns that needs to be extracted and learned from to inform how both these places can evolve or new ones can be created similar to these within the broader Santa Fe context, not just in these historic neighborhoods. Then there's the stacked duplex, and I couldn't specifically find examples, I'm sure there are, but it's just simply one door takes you into a flat on the ground floor, and the other door takes you up to a unit on the upper floor. Once again, all of these reflect they're still house scale, right? Historically, they were on a block. The cottage court, once again, a type that a lot of people really love. This is an Albuquerque example with the Pueblo style. I apologize for the quality of the light, but I wanted to throw that in there to show a regional example of the cottage court. And then if you are interested in diving down into the metrics of these types, if you're a planner or a developer or an architect, we've provided all of these metrics either in the book that's going to be for sale, my Missing Middle book, afterwards, or on missingmiddlehousing.com. And we did that so people could start to understand, if they're interested in diving into those metrics, sort of what they mean. And you can see that just this prototypical missing middle typology generates about 21 units per acre. And what does that mean? It just means that if you are going to have density limitations in your zoning code, that they better at least be 21 units per acre, or you're not going to allow a cottage court. So just a good conversation to have. We've done this for both alley-loaded examples and front-loaded examples, and you can see on this front-loaded example where the driveway has to come in off of the street versus an alley, the density goes down substantially because there's quite a bit of the land area or the lot area that's taken up by the driveway. Okay, and I just wanted to talk about this. So what happens when cities allow this? And this is the little cottage court that we designed in Healdsburg. It's 8 units and 4 ADUs. And the 4 ADUs are detached, and they are sold with 4 of the units. So you get 4 of the owners have a main building, main home, and then an ADU across the alleyway. And they range from 1,200 square feet to 1,750 square feet, 2-bedroom, 1 and 1.5 baths. And the ADUs are 550 square feet, just to give you a sense of the scale of these. But these pretty much sold out immediately. And unfortunately, this did take quite a long time to get entitled. So the prices ended up going up about 20% based on a lengthy entitlement process. So something that was going to be fairly attainable kind of got out of the reach of a lot of households just due to the length of an entitlement process. And so my favorite type is this 4-plex, very simply 2 units on the bottom, 2 units on the top. Very, very few of these, especially for sale, have been built. I couldn't find a single case study of recently built for sale 4-plex. We can talk about that in the panel this evening, but did find examples thanks to Chris Wilson. I'm not sure I don't think he could come tonight, but he talked about this, he pinned it for me. And this is a great local example of a 4-plex. There's always this concern that I like to address, at least very basically, of, it's going to reduce the value of our neighborhoods, right? If we allow duplexes or triplexes, or we can't create, maybe it's from a developer, we can't create a neighborhood that mixes single-family homes in these plexes because people aren't going to want to pay as much. And just here's an example in Louisville, Kentucky, that counters this narrative, where there is a $524,000, sorry, this is the for sale fourplex. This is the only one. I found this like 3 months ago, right? 2-bedroom, 2-bath. And it's on the same block as right next to actually a $1.3 million single family home. And so there's a mix of these missing middle, and it's proving that the values in the neighborhood, because you can walk to a coffee shop and a restaurant, and if it's done well, people don't mind that. That's actually a great part of a really healthy, walkable neighborhood. Townhouses are pretty straightforward, right? There can be a broad range of styles that can be delivered. Most of what I saw here locally is kind of this horizontal, single-story, historic townhouse or triplex style. And I think there's something about this that could really translate into some really cool, attainable, high-quality living solutions here. Fairly similar to this project that we designed in South Jordan, Utah. You can see fairly similar characteristics oriented on a pedestrian muse. And our client was able to deliver these at a price point about $25,000 to $30,000 less than their conventional tuck-under townhouse with the ground floor parking space. And so a really successful example of how thoughtful design can deliver attainability through this idea of missing middle housing. And then I saw some really interesting typologies here locally that, once again, somebody needs to document and translate into something newer. This linear courtyard building, fairly similar to a bungalow court, but just a little bit more intense. The buildings are just a little bit bigger, you can see, based on this aerial photograph. And then this L-shaped court with these smaller sort of private courtyards internal to the project was a super cool one that we saw that I would love somebody locally to just study in more detail. And once again, I just wanted to show this because this solution had, very similar to a lot of these historic examples, that forecourt along the street to break down the massing and the scale, and then a series of passageways that take you to 4 different courtyards within the project area. And every unit is directly accessible off of one of those courtyards. When we start talking about needing to incubate sort of neighborhood main streets, this live-work type has done a really great job in a lot of our recent projects of incubating small local businesses that people want to walk to. We can talk a little bit about that. And then ADUs, which I think are pretty straightforward, and I think you've talked quite a bit about them. I do want to say that missing middle isn't always about having a vacant lot and plopping a duplex or a cottage court on this lot. It's also thinking creatively about where missing middle can incrementally evolve in existing buildings. So you might have an existing duplex or a single family home that involves, sort of adds one ADU, and then it evolves even further and either gets a second ADU or another unit in the back. And I think this idea of incremental is going to be really valuable to you all, especially in your existing neighborhoods and how they can evolve and change and accommodate housing over time. And this was really critical for an island-wide missing middle strategy we did recently for the Hawaii Community Foundation for Maui, sort of post-fire response to the need for housing. And all the solutions that we sort of studied and enforced within the recommendations were this incremental approach to missing middle housing. So stepping now to, yes, there is the housing, but the housing to be most successful needs to exist within a walkable missing middle neighborhood, right? And that's really been our focus over the years, not just housing for housing's sake, but delivering a really high quality solution that includes a missing middle neighborhood. And just a couple of reasons of why this is important. It delivers a really high quality of life. There's always, if I had a block party index, the neighborhoods with a lot of missing middle in them and walkability would probably have the most block parties every year, right? And they deliver attainability, right? There's a broad range of house prices and rent prices in these neighborhoods. They support mobility choices. You might choose to walk a lot of places. You might choose to bike. You might choose to catch the bus, but you might choose to drive too. But maybe 10% of your trips every week you can do in a different way, not using your car. And then improvements to mental and physical health, right? It's not very healthy to spend a lot of time in your car every week. I know your commute times here aren't quite as bad as a lot of places, but they'll only get worse if you don't address this. And then this is obviously a really sustainable alternative for a lot of different reasons, including greenhouse gas reductions, as well as energy use in missing middle building types. So we can talk a little bit about that. So components of a missing middle neighborhood. These missing middle neighborhoods have a neighborhood main street at their core. And so that's represented in these white buildings sort of at the bottom of this diagram. Then you have a mix of missing middle types in the yellow, and then even some single family detached housing on the same block here. But that missing middle, that main street is key to the walkability. And you have some great local examples that we passed by yesterday. And once again, it's just part of the desirability of these neighborhoods is like the first question to a realtor from a household that's looking for these is, what can I walk to? The developers that we work with that deliver the walkable communities, like that's the first question. So you have to be able to answer that. It's not just about a bunch of mixed missing middle. It's like, oh, can I walk to a small market or to a coffee shop or to some cool local businesses that people are making things in? And so that's really, really key. Then this mix of housing types, and I think this is pretty straightforward, but you can mix types on a block. You can have bigger types that are represented here along the bottom, maybe slightly bigger apartment buildings, then transitioning with missing middle housing types. And then this is just a diagram of like that key missing middle block with the main street. And that main street, let's say you have a 200-acre project. The main street's not just one in the 200 acres. It's like every 5 to 7 minute walk, there should be a little node that incubates. It might just be a corner store in some of them that incubates this sort of social center and a commercial center. And we sort of most recently were able to deliver this in a missing middle neighborhood in the Omaha, Nebraska metro, right? Not the place where you typically see the innovation happening, but I'm from Nebraska. I grew up in Nebraska, so I'm super excited to see this happening in Nebraska. So it's a 50-acre site. This is a 2-year-old photo. It's now 90% built out. It's about 450 units built and occupied that are duplex to 8plex. There's no single family detached. And there's a small neighborhood main street here in the foreground. And surprising even to us, a pizza shop opened up in this corner space before any of the housing was built, which is against any retail sort of standard or retail consultant recommendation you'll ever get. And then this whole site here is held to build more pure commercial space when the community's built out and it has become a destination. And so that's coming in later phases. But it's a really cool project. The number represents the number of units in each of the buildings, right? Duplex, 6plex, 4plex, 5plex, and you can see there's a lot of variety in scale, in architecture. It's on a tree-lined street that's very welcoming. Super, super interesting. And in terms of price points, there's a 1-to-3 ratio in the highest rent to the lowest rent within the project, which is pretty rare as well. There's a neighborhood main street. I kept trying to get our client to do a small coffee shop in this corner, but he didn't do it. But there's still opportunity. Laid out in a series of streets and blocks, very sort of simple pattern, but not typical for a lot of projects. And a really important part of this, and I think this is key to your local conversation, is you got to get your street standards right, both with your local engineers and your fire and emergency staff. And so you can see we got 28 curb to curb here with parking on both sides, which is rare, and that was a fight. And the only reason we got this is because the mayor became the biggest fan of this project. He got his staff and us in the room at the very beginning of this submittal and said, we're going to make this happen. He said, you all are going to make this happen, and we're going to be smart about it, but it got entitled in, I think, 3 months. But this 40 feet curb to curb is what we just got asked to design in Athens, Georgia, in a city that just adopted a complete streets strategy and a Vision Zero strategy. and there was no accountability to that engineering decision to ask for not only 40-foot curb to curb, but a turning radius that you could fly around at like 45 miles an hour. So we got it a little bit lower, but this is really important to your walkable neighborhoods. And it's also a key characteristics of how your great neighborhoods function right now. And just have that conversation. The other super interesting part about this project, it is parked, sorry, let me start here. It's in a greenfield location, edge of town. There's no transit, and it's in an environment where the weather gets really cold and snows a lot. And it's parked at 1 parking space per unit off street. And the rest of the parking is on this street. Yes. You must change your parking standards. So this project proves you should never have to require more than 1 off-street parking space. And I'm a fan of not requiring it at all and just letting the market determine. And a lot of the off-street spaces are not garages, they're just parking spaces. And our client does charge a premium for the garages, but it's not impacting the viability and performance of his project. This is actually the highest performing multifamily project in the Omaha Metro right now. It's outperforming every other project, even with on-street parking. Because people can, if you live in this ground floor unit here, you can park 15 feet from your front door and walk into your living room and sort of see your car from your couch, right? Instead of parking in a big parking lot over there somewhere. Let me talk a little bit about comprehensive plans. I just encourage you to make sure as you're diving into this to make missing middle a priority and decide where it should go and make it by right. And we worked on 3 comprehensive plans that had both missing middle sort of as a priority in its policy, as well as sort of the delivery of walkable communities. And they were Plan Cincinnati. I'm not saying any of these are exactly like Santa Fe. They all have little bits and pieces you could learn from, where it had this nodal growth pattern of 42 walkable neighborhoods that the policy reinforced. And then the form-based zoning that we wrote reinforced a whole catalog of missing middle housing types and different catalogs for each of those neighborhoods. And then on a different side of more rural, small town on the island of Kauai, we did an island-wide comprehensive plan that used these sort of walkable place types as the foundation for growth, of channeling growth and housing into these locations. And obviously those place types were they're a little bit different than you would do in most other places across the United States, but that's a really cool strategy. And then we did form-based zoning to implement the community plans in each of those areas. And then Memphis 3.0 also had this pattern of the nodes, and in this instance we called them neighborhood or community anchors, because that's what resonated. And the housing was channeled into those as a priority. And then we did 7 area plans after the comp plan got adopted for 7 of those anchor areas at the same time to demonstrate how the zoning should change to deliver missing middle in those anchors. A really cool example. And then we've also seen a lot of communities prioritize large opportunity sites in their comprehensive or general plans for the delivery of missing middle. And one really great example, and I think we all hope that Santa Fe never becomes Jackson, Wyoming, but you very well could if you don't change the trajectory of where you're going. But they had dedicated a 225-acre site that had 2 landowners as a priority site for the delivery of attainable and workforce housing. And so they hired us to answer the question, could missing middle housing, missing middle neighborhood be competitive from a financial return to the landowners? And could it also deliver the level of attainability that they had wanted? And I'll just say that, I'll jump to a little bit of the conclusion, is we were able, after some really thoughtful pro forma analysis by a group called the Cascadia Group, to demonstrate that it could compete with the returns of large lot single-family homes. And fortunately, the two landowners were longtime family landowners that were committed to the community. And so we were eventually able to get the buy-in. But once again, this idea was, it wasn't just housing for housing's sake. It's in a pattern of a walkable neighborhood with centers, a mix of housing types, a sort of connected street network. And there are these character areas that eventually became the zoning districts, but that's how we introduced them, of like a mix, what mix of housing types would go where. And then we did scenario modeling of 3 different potential outcomes, including business as usual, and we're able to demonstrate with these report cards of how they performed. So it was housing, fiscal analysis, but what other things did the local decision makers want to include? It was like transportation impact, job generation, energy and water use. So you can actually do this and compare those outcomes in a really great way that can inform, so you're not just making a decision in a black hole. Okay, so I'm gonna go through these fairly quickly, just some other important tips and techniques for you to take away, and hopefully they can help inform your conversations about housing generally, but also your comp plan and your zoning. And I just want to say this, that most zoning codes can't tell the difference between these 2 buildings. And this is part of the problem, right? Because they both have 4 units. They both are the same height. They both have the same setback. But they're very different, right? And so you need to make sure that your zoning, if you're allowing a 4-plex, make sure it looks like this and not like that. And one of the ways you can do that is with, it's a fairly common practice now, is we call frontage standards. How does the building address the street is regulated. Yes, you need to have windows, and yes, you need to have doors. And no, the whole front, I know part of what I saw around a lot of the historic examples here of parking in the front, which is, I can understand why it happened, but not a great outcome either in terms of the walkability of the neighborhood. And so you really need to get from this operating system to that operating system, right? That's the general idea with your zoning code update. And then determining where you apply missing middle. And we developed this process over the last 5 years that we call a missing middle scan. And what we decided is that instead of getting caught up in 5 years in one city doing a land development code update, we would do what we call the diagnosis before that surgery, or before a comprehensive plan, where we go into a city. We spend 2 to 3 months I'll tell you what we do, but it's like preparation and a set of recommendations for zoning changes and comp plan policy changes and land use changes. And so what I love about this is we're not just being hired by cities and counties to do this, we're being hired by nonprofit organizations that are basically realizing that they need to play a role in the delivery of these housing solutions and choices. And the client for this in Greenville, South Carolina, was a group called Impact Greenville. It was mostly realtors, but it was some developers and other sort of real estate sort of related industries. And so basically it did a number of things. It first of all introduced missing middle housing to the city and the region in a very visual way, like I'm doing tonight. The second thing it does is it prioritizes geographically where missing middle should be prioritized. We call this the missing middle priority map. And we've got a set process that we've established over the number of years that we review a set of criteria. And you can see here in Greenville, we weren't saying missing middle should go everywhere. We're saying, based on this analysis, that where those blue circles are, that's where you should prioritize the missing middle application. And what's really cool about what Greenville did is they were in the middle of their comp plan, but they took this map and they put it in their comp plan right next to their future land use, and it got adopted. And so now it's policy that missing middle is going to be prioritized in those areas. So now the staff can go in and drill down into the zoning and the policy and the neighborhood plans to make that happen. The third thing we do then is we do this very detailed assessment of the top 4 zoning districts as part of this. And you can see, I'm not going to go through this table, but really it's sort of line by line going through the zoning code and identifying barriers. We do a maximum building envelope, what the regulations allow or encourage, and then what ideally the regulations would allow and encourage. And let me just give you an interesting example. This wasn't Greenville, and I'm not going to say where this was. It's an RM 18 zoning district, so it's supposed to allow 18 units per acre. So we pick the 3 most common lot sizes in this district, and the most common one is a 60-foot wide lot. If you build a single-family home, the side setbacks are only 5 feet, so you can easily build a single-family home. If you're going to build that scary multifamily, the side setbacks are both 15 feet. So this represents the development potential on the most common lot size in that zoning district. So obviously something needs to change. So we sort of build this ideal outcome, and then we back into a set of zoning standards that will deliver that plex on that 60-foot lot. And then there's an extensive list of, basically a checklist for the staff to go through and make changes to their comprehensive plan and their zoning codes. They usually do that on their own and sometimes bring us in for strategic advising. But the intent is for the city staff to take ownership of that. You can think about secondary corridors as a great place for missing middle. Transitions from higher intensity corridors is a great location for missing middle. You see, where you're going to allow bigger buildings, great transition into single family neighborhoods. And then these really low value gray field sites that are pretty much everywhere in every kind of edge of a edge city in the United States can become missing middle neighborhoods, right? And so as you can see, visualization is really, really important part of this, because most people couldn't have grasped that ugly parking lot could become this, or think they would ever want to live there, right? So, this could be hugely controversial, but I just want to plant this seed is because 75% or more of your residential zone land is zoned for single family, you might need to think about which of those areas might need to enable some missing middle, and just be really thoughtful about that. I just want to mention that this was a new diagram that we created just a couple years ago as we were doing a lot of these missing middle efforts citywide is, right, we want to make sure that the changes we make can allow a developer to deliver a project that's attainable, feasible. We want to make sure when they run their pro forma that it makes sense for them to take the risk to build this project. Otherwise, there's no reason to do this. But secondarily, it's just as important to make sure that whatever you're encouraging delivers attainable solutions, and that's a little bit harder to do. But you also want to make sure you're delivering livability, not just housing for housing's sake, right? You want to make sure that that's a really strong component. And so I'm going to quickly go through this. The process is really, right, we have these lot sizes, we test an outcome. Our development consultant sort of runs the numbers. They say you were close, but these 3 things you need more units, you need more square footage, you need less parking. We do a refined income, goes back into the sort of pro forma analysis, and then we have a final version that informs the policy and the zoning. So that's a really important iterative process. And we give them scores here about delivering feasibility and attainability. And I talked about this a little bit, but I think this is a really valuable image because it shows the exact same building as a single family home that generates a density of 7 units per acre. Split it into a duplex, it's 14 units per acre. Delivered into a fourplex, it's 28 units per acre. Delivered into an eightplex, it's 56 units per acre. And what you can see is the building didn't change at all, but by splitting it into different units, you get more attainability. But if you're using a density-based system, you're probably not going to allow 60 units per acre or even probably 27. So really interesting part. And the way that we directly approach this in terms of allowed uses in our form-based zoning is we just simply list, instead of going from single family, townhouse, and jumping immediately to multifamily, we introduce this full range of missing middle typologies directly in each of the zoning districts. We just are really upfront about what's allowed in those districts. Let's see, I'm pretty close to time here, right? So I'm just gonna say is, as I looked at some of this background information, right, every neighborhood's probably going to have a slightly different and more nuanced solution that I think is really important. And I just wanted to, in our Sacramento, California citywide missing middle strategy, we ran pro formas by each neighborhood or each market, different market within the community, and that was really helpful in informing the zoning. And obviously we don't draw these illustrations just to have a pretty picture. This is an actual lot that has an existing single family home that we're just assuming would become a fourplex with 2 ADUs. And so we illustrate what that would look and feel like so the community can understand the intent of this process. And we can talk about this a little bit more in the panel, but what we found in Sacramento is that it's really hard to compete with a large single family home or a sort of luxury townhouse from an infill standpoint. And so we had to incentivize the fourplex and figure out a way to do that. So the city of Sacramento eliminated density caps completely, eliminated density caps in their comprehensive plan. And it has a maximum FAR, floor area ratio, or basically a container or a size of a building. And you can put any number of units within that. And the more units you put in it, the more FAR you get, the more development potential you get. And we found that that was necessary to enable the fourplex to have the rate of return that performed equally or a little bit better than a large single family house. So, okay, parking. We could talk about this all night tonight. But I just want to mention, we've done a better job, a couple of messages, we've done a better job delivering spaces for cars than homes for people. Like if you look at our landscape of any US city. And also, it's really important is you can't be against reducing parking requirements and for attainable housing. There's a mismatch there. You just can't. So the reduction of parking requirements has to be part of the housing strategy, and the delivery of missing middle will not happen without it. And this is a great Banksy mural if you don't know, but I loved sort of the play on sort of this parking that he did in this mural in Los Angeles. Once again, this is that neighborhood in Nebraska. This is the example, suburban location, parked 1 space per unit, functions really well with the on-street parking that it delivers. And then I just want to show this really quickly is encouraging cities to accommodate innovation. And this is our car-free community in Tempe, Arizona called Cul-de-sac. That would be the largest car-free community in the country when it's completed. It's got about 300 residents. But not only is it car-free, but it had the intent of being mobility rich, which it's adjacent to a light rail. They're delivering transit passes, car share, bike share, scooter share passes at a reduced rate for residents. And I'm just going to show you a little glimpse of it. It's got a mixed-use center with a market, a restaurant, bike shop, a bunch of cool small local businesses. It's become a destination. It was in BBC last week as a travel destination. So just look it up. I have the first project I've ever designed that's become an international travel destination. Once again, this sort of courtyard housing typology, a lot of it was based on the Barrio Viejo, sort of in Tucson that we studied, or even some of the Mediterranean places that we all love to visit. But I just loved this was in the BBC article that at full build out that this project will save 2.2 to 3.6 tons of greenhouse gas emissions annually. So simply removing cars and giving people that option. 50% of the first phase residents moved here from outside of the state to live car-free. So there's a real demand for this, and even if it's a 2% of the market wants it, we're not building it. So there's a demand for it. They have really cool artist markets, great energy. We can go tour it sometime. And then we're utilizing this story map digital platform, and I just highly encourage you to look at that for some of your community planning processes. We did it in Louisville for a citywide missing middle strategy. So it makes all of that information that's in a PDF or a document that sits on a shelf, it makes it easily accessible in an online interface. It's a really great system. And then streamlining delivery is obviously really key. And this pre-approved building plans is a kind of a really trendy thing right now. Jennifer Settle, who runs our Chicago office, did this for South Bend, Indiana. It was one of the first cities that did it, and basically a small infill builder can come to the city and say, I want to, for free, they can actually use one of those pre-approved plans and do an infill project and go directly to building permits without any design or even zoning consistency review. So we've done the same thing for a lot of ADU places. I wrote a couple of articles about things you should think about if you're going to approach this, because it's not as easy as you might think. One of the big questions and debates we usually have with the city attorney is who's taking on the liability. Because as an architect, my professional liability agent is like, I can't insure you for unlimited number of use of your buildings. And so there's a lot of technical pieces of this. And then 5 mistakes that are pretty common. So wrapping up, I do want to say that we all have, or most of us will have, personal stories to tell about missing middle. This is my great-grandmother, and she lived in a duplex. And I hadn't really thought about this until ARP was interviewing me a while back, and I realized that I first experienced missing middle growing up. And she had like probably a 650 square foot unit home, but it was everything she needed, and it was within walking distance of the main street. And so it was everything she needed at that point in her life. But I just encourage, one of the things you could do locally is gather personal stories about missing middle. Some point in your life, you probably lived in it. Your kids might live in it now, your aunt, your best friend. And then there's some tips that I'm not going to go through all these, but I just encourage you to, take part in this conversation about missing middle and shift the conversation away from density, multifamily, and start becoming familiar with the terminology, the typologies. Go on some walking tours, sort of see these things in person. Maybe fly and go see some of these places. And then the other thing is think about doing one of these missing middle scans. Like could this prep your city, sort of give you the sort of direction you need to sort of direct the comp plan and the zoning to support this. And then there's a lot of other strategies I talked about that you can take away. But what I would say is that I'm very active on LinkedIn. If you want to just reach out, and if you're active on LinkedIn, I'd be happy to have you as part of my LinkedIn network. I do want to say that Collected Works, after the panel, is selling my book, and I'm going to be, if you want me to sign it, I'm happy to sign the book for you. But please do support your local bookstore. I'm not saying that to just buy my book, but I love when the local sort of bookstores show up and sort of sell my book. And go to missingmiddlehousing.com. If you want to learn a little bit more. But I think part of this is what I love about an audience like this is it's pretty clear that there's a lot of different expertise in the room. Some of you might be developers, some of you might be architects, some of you are just community members, lawyers, planners. And what's great is each one of you can play a role and need to play a role in the delivery of these housing solutions. So just encourage you all, and I think coming here today demonstrates that you're committed to doing this, of stepping up and playing the important role that you need to play in delivering these attainable solutions to really keep Santa Fe the type of place that it is, reinforce the type of place it is, and make sure it's this welcoming of community that sort of welcomes and provides choices for everyone into the future. So thank you for coming tonight. Look forward to the conversation.
I'd like to welcome up Daniel Hernandez and Lisa Gavioli. Is this working? Okay. Thank you so much, Daniel. That was such a wealth of information. Really excellent to get such a visual and interesting overview of, oh God, I'm having a problem. Okay, sorry. It was just such a great visual and overview of this really important subject. So I'd like to welcome Lisa Gavioli and Daniel Hernandez up here for a short panel. We're going to have just a few questions, and then, of course, we'll take audience questions. So Daniel Hernandez is a real estate developer, planner, and project manager, and the founder of Proyecto. Daniel worked several years to create and implement the redevelopment plans for Midtown District in Santa Fe. On that project, he was a development consultant and the former Metropolitan Redevelopment Agency director. Thank you for joining us tonight, Daniel. Next to Daniel is Lisa Gavioli. Lisa serves as the administrator for Tierra Contenta Corporation and as a senior project manager with NV5. She has close to 2 decades of experience working at the nexus of planning, development, housing, and historic preservation. So this is an opportunity for, I think, a very rich conversation that will ground these ideas of missing middle housing in our little city here in Santa Fe. So I'd like to start with a little bit of an update about both Midtown and Tierra Contenta, as I think these are both interesting and important projects that connect to this conversation. So, Daniel, would you mind starting talking a little bit about Midtown, describing the vision of the project, the status of the project, and how you see it connecting to what Daniel talked about tonight?
Yeah, first, is it on? Now? Yeah. I want to thank Dan, actually, for doing a great presentation about, I think that sort of establishes the premise of what Midtown Master Plan was all about. It was created to actually create that dense space. So Opticos created the plan, and it provided for a variety of housing types throughout the plan. But it was also seen as a center also. So it was also probably one of the only places in Santa Fe where we could actually get higher density than a lot of the missing middle housing that you presented. Yep. But also recognizing that there were surrounding neighborhoods that were going to be affected by the master plan and the opportunity to actually do missing middle housing in those neighborhoods. One of the outcomes of the master planning process with the community was to create a neighborhood stabilization plan for an adjacent neighborhood. And that neighborhood actually is prime opportunity for the kind of missing middle housing that was presented tonight. And the Office of the Metropolitan Redevelopment Agency is creating a stabilization plan for that neighborhood focused on increasing housing types and particularly around affordability. But again, the Midtown Master Plan itself was a center of gravity for a lot of those surrounding neighborhoods, so that those surrounding neighborhoods actually would have walkable distance to Midtown where a lot of the commercial activity would occur. The other thing that was really important for the Midtown plan was building off an existing zoning that surrounded the Midtown site, which was a commercial district, and one of the parking lots that you showed up here reminded me of the opportunities along Cerrillos and St. Mike's for those missing middle type housing projects to occur. So I feel like Midtown, the vision for Midtown was actually to be an impetus for this kind of development to occur. And I'm glad to say that all the parcels at Midtown have development proposals on them. Some of them have this scale, this missing middle housing scale, as well as a higher density scale because of the commercial that's down below. So there's a variety of housing types and uses throughout the district. And also we are preserving a lot of the existing buildings there. So I feel like this project is going to be a catalyst and an opportunity to actually present to the communities of Santa Fe that, one, there's an existing market that's going to desire and seek these housing types, but also that they begin showing a prototype for things that can happen in other districts throughout Santa Fe.
That's great. Lisa, would you share kind of a similar perspective on Tierra Contenta?
Sure. Is this working? Can't hear myself. Well, Tierra Contenta was founded over 30 years ago as a planned community to really encourage and in fact require a high level of affordability. So there's a requirement for 40% affordability throughout the master plan area in Tierra Contenta. To date, the first 2 phases of Tierra Contenta are all but complete, and phase 3 is getting ready to launch. Phase 3 is in the midst of getting its master plat approved. As we were, I will say that the Tierra Contenta Corporation amended the master plan back in 2021, and in doing so also created design standards for phase 3A of Tierra Contenta that really very heavily relied on missing middle housing and your work, Dan. And the real vision has evolved for Tierra Contenta to not only create affordable housing, but to create community, and really acknowledging that a mixture of incomes and a mixture of housing types in particular helps to create community, in addition to encouraging innovation and reintroducing some of these housing types that have fallen out of our vocabulary in Santa Fe.
I wanted to start with these two projects because I think they represent a real potential for how Santa Fe can grow. And you referenced this in one of your slides, Dan, but there's this concept of polycentrism, which is kind of this idea that, we live in a city that part of it was built before the car, and it's a extremely walkable, like the scale is very beautiful, very human scaled part of town. And then the city grew after zoning codes, as you referenced, it really in response to kind of like a more single family pattern development and around the car in a much more real way. And now I think what we see is we're seeing a lot of new apartment development, and it's really great that we're having housing, but a lot of those apartments are actually getting built like really on the edge of the city. So you're seeing these nodes of density with no amenities, with no green space, just housing. And so it feels like that's not what we're trying for here. I think what we should be trying for is this kind of idea of polycentrism, which it's challenging to reintroduce walkability in the context of a land use pattern built around the car, right? But one way you can do that is kind of nodes of mix of housing types, mix of uses, and higher density. That like a node like Midtown, like the Plaza, to some degree Tierra Contenta, and that then you can connect those nodes with transit and with trail connections, so you could really live potentially without a car or with one car in your family. So can you just talk a little bit about that idea, Dan, where you've seen that work and what is required in order to make that center, like new centers, work?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it work in a pretty broad range of different context types. And just as an example, one of the first places we did it was Beaufort County, South Carolina. Not a place that you would imagine, but we were hired, this was 15 years ago, to identify where growth should happen and how to deliver a compact, walkable, built environment and neighborhoods in those areas. And it was primarily to preserve the rural context, but also a degrading natural environment. That sort of water quality and all sorts of other issues were popping up. And so those nodes can be a place for directing the growth, but it also, as you mentioned, can become the place like the Midtown where it has the broader mix of scales and types and uses. And it does become a great way to be what we call transit supportive. So even if transit doesn't currently exist, it means that it could potentially exist in the future. And it gets away from what you said of like, there's nothing worse in my mind than density without amenity, which is like the way most cities are doing it, just because it's the little bits and pieces of land that's left over. And it's like the only reason somebody's going to live there is because that's where they can afford to live, and they're going to move as soon as they can afford to live somewhere else, or if they can't afford. And that's really not the smart way. I know we all would agree that's not the smart way to grow. So, and then it can happen in a combination of like retrofitting existing opportunity sites and identifying new growth areas. But I think it's how those get stitched together becomes really critical as part of that strategy, and it usually starts in a comprehensive plan. And in Beaufort County, we did it as like a vision plan that basically became the comprehensive plan, future land use, and a framework for that nodal place-based mobility plan for the county. So it really, it can inform and should inform all of the planning and policy once it's implemented.
That's great. And to that point of kind of general plan, which is a process that we are in right now. In fact, we have a general plan table that you can come talk to after this talk. Weigh in on our general plan. What do you, all three of you, really think we need to be, keeping our eye on in this general plan process to create the kind of future Santa Fe that allows for this diversity, this attainability and housing cost, and this kind of walkability? Like, what feels most important to focus on?
From my perspective, just having worked on the Midtown plan and its implementation, is to have as many as of right, with parameters and conditions, of course, but the opportunity for as of right to build certain types of building types and housing types. I've found that it's very uncertain and unclear from the moment that you create something to the moment that you actually get your approvals, that process, and you brought it up earlier, Dan, that it just basically increases the cost of the project, therefore increases the cost to the consumer. And so having, the parameters and the conditions around which we can build buildings like that, and even apartment buildings in the right places, and allowing those types of things as of right, like the Link does currently, I think if we can use that at a broader level throughout the city, we'll see the kind of development that we want to see.
I think to echo that to a certain extent, I think as a matter of policy to encourage a variety of housing type and to identify where those can go in places like Midtown and places like Tierra Contenta. But I think in general, our policy document needs to speak to what the barriers have been to creation of diversity of housing type, and really speaks to identifying what those tools will be to removing those barriers.
I think what I say partially repetitive, but I think it's important, is I think three things I would reinforce is this what's the nodal pattern that the future land use or some sort of form and character map might reinforce, being really specific about which types go where, what scales go where. And then third of all, I think it's just as important as those first two and as rarely done as, and we found it really successful, is determining a degree of change for every sub area in the city. Because some areas, it's usually it's the terminology changes everywhere, but it's a maintain where there's not a whole lot of change that's likely going to happen or be encouraged both from a public and a private. There's evolve, where there's going to be probably some public investment and then encouraging private investment, and there's transform, like a Midtown, where it's going to be it's going to completely, the policy is it's going to completely change. And if every area has that degree of change mapped, there's no surprises for community members. And John Zena, who's the planning director for Memphis, wrote a really great article for Planning Magazine on degree of change after we used it in that plan. So if you're interested, look that up.
Yeah, that's a really helpful frame. And I think another point that you make that's really important and something to lift up is this idea that we have a lot of hidden missing middle housing here, and that it's actually quite a common housing typology, but we don't see it so much. So I just think that that's a relevant part of this conversation. I have so many more questions, but I'm going to turn it over to Veronica to take audience questions.
How about now? Okay, great. Thank you all for submitting such terrific questions. We have time for a couple of these. How can we promote missing middle and diverse housing styles that may not be the most profitable for developers, but would benefit the community?
I mean, there's a couple of things. I think part of the strategy is you need to make them equally as profitable to developers, unless it's a nonprofit developer that's delivering subsidized affordable housing. Otherwise, you won't get it. So it does, and that's kind of that, some of those nuanced tools that we used, like in the Sacramento project, where it had a sliding scale of allowed development potential. So the more units you delivered, the more development potential you got, was what was necessary to get the return for the developer at a price point that was competitive with a luxury house or a luxury townhouse. And that's what we found is you need to do that. You really, otherwise there might be some smaller local builders who are okay with a return that's a little lower. That they're but generally speaking, I would say what we've seen to really be effective is it has to be competitive. But I would say is if you can define that and you can deliver a streamlined process, your regulations are objective, your review process is objective, and you can get from start to finish in the entitlement process really easily, the developer would be happy to deliver what you're asking for if you can say, we can give you the path to entitlement quickly. And I think that's a challenge in most cities because zoning is so bad in most places, it's become a culture of negotiation. And so like that's the most risk for developers having to come in and spend sometimes years negotiating in that way. So you need to get rid of that.
I almost cried when I heard that somewhere they got their entitlements in 3 months.
Nebraska. Yeah.
Veronica?
This is a very related question, but I think really builds on what you were just saying. So the city currently requires an early neighborhood notification meeting, staff reviews, and planning commission approval, sometimes city council approval, for any development with 3 or more dwelling units. Do you think this could be hindering the development of missing middle housing in Santa Fe? And how could this be restructured?
In a word, yes. I think what has been really exciting for developers and for me and the staff at the redevelopment agency is that the master plan that was created allows developers to actually understand what can and cannot be built as of right. They don't have to go through this lengthy process. And if we can begin replicating that kind of objective parameters about what needs to be built or what people want to see built in a specific zone, then the developer can deliver that without their risks going so out of control because of the uncertainty of that approvals process. So I think, again, Midtown, I feel like has a lot of keys to establishing a way that development can happen, the type of development, again, that we want to see.
How do you see other communities plan for walkable neighborhoods when existing infrastructure has been built without this in consideration? You can build middle housing walkable neighborhoods, but if the commercial aspect doesn't take root, don't you risk still not having walkability?
Absolutely. That's why I didn't get a chance to talk a lot about the cul-de-sac sort of retail incubation strategy, but we've been sort of refining that approach for 15 years now since we worked in Seaside, Florida, and saw how they incubated a very vibrant town center over the course of 30 years. But it's if you need to be thoughtful about sort of a developer doesn't want to take a big risk and build like 40,000 square feet of pure commercial space out of the gate and hope that the commercial tenants will come up. So in cul-de-sac, as an example, is they hosted Thursday night flea markets once the site grading was done, and it became a destination. So the second the first business opened, people were already in the pattern of going to cul-de-sac to sort of be social and to spend money and support local businesses. And so the other thing that happened is we designed these 700 square foot spaces on the main plaza that if the commercial or retail didn't show up, they could become an apartment as a backup, but they all leased up in 2 hours, and they're now converting the rest of the ground floor units into commercial spaces. And so then they did the last thing they did is they built a beer garden, which was like low expense, kind of high return, authentic, placemaking experience that people seem to love. And so there's all these little pieces that if you can do it really thoughtfully without spending a lot of money and create a place and make the commercial uses viable. And like in cul-de-sac, one of the best performing businesses was a vintage clothing store. And they were so successful in their 700-foot space, they've now moved into a 2,000 square foot sort of permanent retail space. So you can be thoughtful about that, because I agree, you can have the best mix of missing middle, but if you don't have that walkability, it's like, it's not the same. Definitely not the
I
same.
want to piggyback on that just briefly. You know, at Midtown, you had talked about the pizza place that went
Yeah.
in. That's actually one of the first commercial things that's going to happen at Midtown. I don't know if Phil is here tonight, but the developer for the film production studios, one of the first phases is actually bringing in a pizza guy who's going to open up a restaurant across the street from the screen. So the screen and the pizza place is going to open up at the same time. That plus, you know, we thought a lot about in the office, and Carly Venditti is here. We thought a lot about those open space opportunities to begin bringing people back to Midtown. So they're organizing a concert now for the fall, and so we want to begin those first phases of outdoor spaces to begin building out possibly a beer garden or other things. But definitely the first thing that's going to come out is this concert. We hope to have it every year moving forward. But, you know, we're just trying to build that momentum of like, this is a place. People want to come back here. We're creating opportunities for you to come back to Midtown.
One of the challenges is there's very few retail consultants that have an expertise in this sort of incubation, so you have to be really, really creative about it. And it's usually even finding a business owner who sort of has gone through sort of incubating a few of their own businesses that can help strategize, or maybe bringing in small local businesses that might want a second location, like a coffee shop or something creative like that, where they're not all new businesses that are going to maybe turn over more quickly. So there's like a toolkit, and I'll say that we're working on a little toolkit that I'm super excited about, because I think it's critical to the walkability of the neighborhoods for sure.
Okay, final question that we have time for this evening. We have many homes in Santa Fe that are 7, 8, 9, and even over 10,000 square feet, yet many people oppose dense, small unit walkable developments. How can we change the conversation to show that density is more efficient and less impactful than large homes on large lots?
I'd like to speak to this question if I could.
Yeah.
I'm the former Historic Preservation Division Manager for the City of Santa Fe. And so I'm quite familiar with our missing middle housing stock as being historic. I think, repeat the end of that question.
How can we change the conversation to show that density is more efficient and less impactful than
Thank you.
large homes on large lots?
Thank you. I think pointing to our historic housing stock as existing, as having been built before zoning largely was in place, and as not legally buildable under the current zoning code, is really important. I think also using visuals, speaking to local examples, and perhaps also revealing that a lot of the history of zoning in legislating out these housing types was also part of a project of legislating out certain classes of people. And so revealing that bias that went into some of those original forms of zoning nationwide, not just in Santa Fe, but really moving towards a more equitable situation that is more inclusive to all of our community members, I think is really important.
I'm thinking of it from a political perspective as well, in community meetings, et cetera. But it feels like, you know, what's been effective in other places that I've worked in on the housing issues, it's been about creating housing choices. So yes, 10,000 square feet home, absolutely have at it. But we have a lot of young people. We have older people who just want one-bedroom apartments or, you know, other types of housing, and we want to create housing for them. And there is not that type. And like, it's less than 10% of our entire housing stock in the city is our townhouses, duplexes, fourplexes, courtyard housing. We just don't have it. So creating the dialogue about, let's create housing choices for your kids, for your mom and dad, for whatever. So I feel like that's probably where we need to start. Definitely bringing in the historic typologies that we have. They're so rich. So then it doesn't become like, I don't know about that design. Well, it's like it's existing in our neighborhoods. So anyway, I think we need to just talk about housing choices in our city and making sure that we're building housing for the broad range of housing of population that we have in the city.
Can I say one last thing, building upon two great comments? Is I know this wasn't the intent of that question, but the goal should never be building for or promoting density. This is not about density. This is about preserving and creating the type of place that you all live currently and want to live, and that you want Santa Fe to be. That is the intent, and there are density numbers, and I know that wasn't the intent, but we often default to that, and that's not the intensity. That's not the intent at all, right? The intent is the type of place, and the housing choice, and the great history and culture of it. And so I think that as a foundation, like that's really what this is about, and it's not forcing any particular option on anybody. It's like providing enough choices for everybody.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists for joining us this evening, and thank you so much to DanParolek for coming and talking all about this tonight. Please join me in thanking them. Yeah, more conversation over food and drink. We're grateful to Collected Works for being here this evening with copies of Daniel's book, Missing Middle Housing, available for purchase. He'll be signing copies, so please come get a copy, get it signed. And then we look forward to seeing you for our next speaker series session on September 23rd, entitled Planting the Rain to Grow Abundance, with Brad Lancaster, author of Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond. He is the co-founder of neighborhoodforesters.org. Brad will share practical ways to work with natural systems, harvesting rainwater, reusing gray water, growing shade, building fertile soil, and revitalizing public spaces to create healthier, more resilient environments. Brad will highlight how regenerative practices can better shape local development and policies to support long-term water security. You can use the QR code behind me to register, or just visit livabilityspeakerseries.com. In a moment, we'll break for food and drink. When you walked in, you received a card with a couple of discussion questions, which are also here on the screen. We encourage you to use those as you chat with people you know and don't know to debrief the session. Please join us. There's food and drinks in the hallway, and we look forward to connecting more. Thank you for being here.